Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. What can we say about the mental state of Donald Trump? A respected reporter, Ezra Klein, has bluntly asserted the President of the United States is not well. Trump's behavior is odd, to say the least, but what can we reasonably discern from afar about his mental stability? Is he up to the demands of his office? Is he capable of leading our military if war were to break out? Is he stable and competent enough to make responsible decisions about the use of nuclear weapons? I'll ask my guest, a forensic psychiatrist who has publicly expressed serious concerns about the president's mental capacity and fitness to serve. She's Dr. Bandy X. Lee, an assistant professor of law and psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Lee, welcome. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
What are the specific concerns, or some of the specific concerns that you have about the mental state of the president?
First of all, let me say that I speak for myself and not for my university.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the concerns that we have seen, not just myself, but 27 psychiatrists and mental health professionals who have put our concerns in a book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, centers around his dangerousness. We see a lot of signs, psychological, cognitive, and neurological, but those in the office that hold so much power and access to the most powerful weapons on earth are very concerning to us. And while we cannot make a definitive diagnosis from afar or make any conclusions from afar, the signs are numerous enough and alarming enough that we've been calling for an evaluation.
Can you be a little more specific about the signs and the ways in which they might potentially be dangerous?
Yes. So the best predictor for future violence is past violence. And Mr. Trump has shown a tendency for violence in terms of verbal aggressiveness, a history of sexual assault, his inciting of violence at rallies, his endorsement of violence in key speeches, which could actually lead to a culture of violence that leads to epidemics of violence, far greater than striking one person at a time. And he has shown an attraction to violence. He goes into an attack mode. He also glorifies violence and powerful weapons. And he has this constant need to burnish a sense of power, which makes him highly attracted to and perhaps tempted to use powerful weapons. The more powerful they are, the more tempting they will be.
When you mention a history of sexual assault, you're talking about his comments about groping women, unwanted touching, that sort of thing?
Yes, and the credible allegations, as well as his having boasted about them.
Right.
That is actually more concerning.
You mentioned your 27 colleagues, so you held a conference up at Yale. Can you talk about how the idea for the conference came about and how these 27 participants were selected?
Although we cannot diagnose from afar, there is still a lot that mental health professionals can tell, because it is our special knowledge to be able to tell apart what is normal from what is pathological. And this was a time when the country was stating that the president was settling in his position, he was becoming more normal and pivoting in his ways.
Pivot was a term that came up frequently. Yeah.
Yes, and from our perspective, that wasn't true.
Right.
And we were wondering if we had a duty to inform the public if we felt that they were in danger. And in fact, we were concerned about dangerousness from the start. When I asked around to my colleagues, they shared my concerns, and it was in fact rather pretty much a consensus. No one would put their names forth in any of the letters I tried to write to Congress or any statements I was hoping to make. I thought that the silence was rather odd and perhaps a problem, so I decided to organize a conference on
So these were
whether-
mental health professionals who were concerned about the president as you were, but were unwilling to go on the record or sign their name to letters expressing their concern, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Right.
And so the purpose of the conference was to speak about ethics, the ethics of having, whether we had a duty to warn and educate about the dangerousness of a public figure. But only 20 people showed up to a 500-person auditorium. And when I asked around in private, they said they were afraid of being targeted, either litigiously by a president who uses lawsuits vindictively, and so they would be fighting for their licenses the rest of their careers, or by his violence-prone followers, and that they would be fearing for their own and their family's safety. And, but instead, more than 100 people tuned in online, and then once the meeting got out to the public in terms of news and coverage, then hundreds and hundreds of mental health professionals got in touch with me. Now they're in several thousands, and we formed a national coalition, all those who are concerned about the dangerousness of this president. There
was a book that emerged from the conference that was called, you mentioned it, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and that's a collection of essays by 27 of your colleagues. So how were the 27 selected?
As you can see, it's a very small sample among those who have come forth, and
they're very distinguished names, I might add.
Yes.
It's a collection of people who are considered very distinguished in the field.
Yes, perhaps the most eminent members of our field, and they have put their reputation forth and their name forward for the good of the public. And the book itself is meant as a public service, that we considered it a part of our professional responsibility to be witnessing professionals of the danger that we saw, and for the health and safety of the public.
The concerns that you have, I mean, one of the obvious concerns is the potential use of nuclear weapons. Are there other concerns that you can speak specifically about, or other concerns that some of the folks who wrote these essays have mentioned?
Yes, we've been concerned about the dangerousness of having such a mentally unstable person from all that we can see from the signs in such a position of power. And of course, our primary concern and the most urgent concern is the use of nuclear weapons that could annihilate human life on Earth, as well as other forms of life. But there are also different levels of danger that we see that have already borne out. We see from the data that are already out that hate crimes have spiked in unprecedented ways since the day after election and have not abated. There has been widespread schoolyard bullying done in Mr. Trump's name, using his rhetoric, that is also at alarming levels. And there has been an unprecedented escalation in gun deaths since his campaign. There are also many reports of violence by white supremacists. But these are just some of the more obvious ones. What is most concerning is the culture, the foundation for a new culture of violence that he is laying, that is far more powerful than perhaps any of these. If you look at how violence is caused, social, cultural, and economic factors play a much larger role in escalation of rates of violence than any individual factors, and even specific causes that individuals might attribute. And that is the part that will probably bear out to be the most significant in terms of the increases in homicides and suicides that we will see in society in general. And that is while not even going into our relationships with other nations, alienating our allies and constantly provoking hostile nations and taunting especially a nation with nuclear power. These are the kinds of things that heighten international insecurity and also lay out a new culture a new international culture of wars, nuclear proliferation, and insecurity.
One of the things you wrote in The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump is, and this is a quote, "Possibly the oddest experience of my career as a psychiatrist has been to find that the only people not allowed to speak about an issue are those who know the most about it." What did you mean there?
Well, I was specifically referring to the American Psychiatric Association's expansion of the Goldwater Rule.
And the Goldwater Rule is, explain what that is.
Yes, the Goldwater Rule was put in place in 1973 after the experience of Barry Goldwater's run for presidency in 1964, whereby a magazine called Fact put out a survey to 12,000 psychiatrists, and less than 10% wrote back stating that he was unfit to be president. But that, of course, the magazine sensationalized it, and he lost the presidency by landslide, and then sued the magazine and won a case of libel. And after that, the American Psychiatric Association instituted as an ethical guideline prohibiting psychiatrists from diagnosing public figures without having examined them and gotten consent to do so. I actually agree with that rule.
And you're a member of the association?
I used to be. I actually withdrew from the association more than 10 years ago as their ties with pharmaceutical companies had been growing. Right. So I actually resigned for a different reason, but currently many dozens of members have resigned from the American Psychiatric Association since their March 2017 expansion of the Goldwater Rule. Basically, the Goldwater Rule has been in effect and is reasonably well known, as you have pointed out, since the 70s. But this expansion was not well covered at all. I didn't even know about it until recently. So explain what this expansion is and how it came about and why it came about. Yes, I think it's very important because I believe that norms and standards should stay the same, even in times of intense political pressure. Otherwise, we can easily become corrupt and collude with a destructive regime. We have seen that happen with the American Psychological Association, in fact. During the Iraq War, under political pressure, they modified their actual ethical guidelines to allow for enhanced interrogation and therefore participation in torture.
Right.
And that is how military psychologists came to be designers and implementers of torture. So I think that's a very cautionary tale, that we should not change our ethical guidelines during times of political intensity.
So the Goldwater Rule was changed, and when did that occur?
It happened on March 16th of 2017, when they issued a 3-page reinterpretation of a 2-line rule, basically outlining that the Goldwater Rule did not only mean diagnosing public figures, but psychiatrists were prohibited from making any comment on any objective, observable affect, speech, or behavior of a public figure under any circumstance, even an emergency.
So you are an expert in this area, and I am not. I'm a journalist. But according to this expansion of the Goldwater Rule, it will be absolutely fine for me to comment every which way I want to about Trump's mental condition, but you are not supposed to do that.
But as a psychiatrist, we are gagged. Many have called it a gag rule, and it was clearly an attempt to silence the profession because it makes no sense from the way the rule is written in the books. And it is an unprecedented expansion from their history. In fact, they were, in accordance with the science, they were actually on the path of phasing out the Goldwater Rule, even discussed making it an etiquette rather than a rule. And
so, excuse me, so it seems that the timing would seem to make it clear that it's pretty safe to say this expansion occurred because the association does not want psychiatrists speaking out about the mental state of Donald Trump.
This current administration, yes. 2 months into this administration, there was no scientific or philosophical basis for this expansion.
Now, you mentioned that you support the original Goldwater Rule. So could you just explain, and that rule is essentially saying that you should not make a diagnosis of a public figure that you have not examined. Explain the difference between issuing an opinion in public about a public figure and actually making a diagnosis from afar.
Actually, a diagnosis and a professional opinion are somewhat similar in that they are full opinions of an individual based on complete information, including, I believe, an in-person interview is usually necessary for me. That is why I know that I'm a strong proponent of the rule, because for 20 years of forensic practice, when I've been asked to diagnose even minor public figures from afar, I have not done so. And I think that level of standard is reasonable for commenting on a public figure. But now they are prohibiting any comment whatsoever and counting that as a full professional opinion, which has never been the case. In fact, no other specialty requires this. And for instance, if you detected signs of Ebola or HIV, wouldn't you be required to report it at least to the authorities, if not alert the public, according to medical ethical guidelines? And here we are seeing multiple dangerous signs, and yet we cannot speak about them.
Now, your position and the position of the colleagues who feel the same way or similarly to you has been controversial. And a couple of concerns have been raised. The first, and the easier one to grapple with, is the concern that this is just political, that you and your colleagues are liberals or Democrats and you don't like what's going on with a Republican president. What's your response to that?
I think psychiatry and science can serve as an antidote to some of that. First of all, we are not all Democrats, and we're not even all liberal. And certainly among the thousands of us, there are Republicans as well. This is a medical observation based on natural phenomena and our clinical judgment based on our observation-based, clinical data-based training. And whereas a politician might not be able to separate oneself from the political leanings one has, a health professional is almost routinely required to separate oneself from one's ideological leanings or any other sort. In fact, there's no room for any of that to enter into medical judgment. Because you essentially bring medical neutrality. That means applying the same standards of medical practice regardless of political affiliation, and that's how we're able to treat members across enemy lines during wartime. Right. It's purely based on science and research and clinical training, and we are concerned with illness versus health, life versus death, not left versus right.
Now, the other concern is a more serious concern, in my opinion, and that is that whenever psychiatrists or other mental health officials begin to become involved in politics or with government, that there's a danger that they could become ethically compromised. The extreme example is the kind of thing that went on in the Soviet Union when psychiatrists were used to declare that dissidents were mentally ill, and terrible things happened to many of the dissidents. There's nothing like that going on here, obviously, but how do we know when mental health professionals might be getting on, embarking upon a slippery slope?
Right, and there seems to be confusion even among psychiatrists, especially there's a past president of the APA who has repeatedly expressed this concern. It is exactly the concern that we speak about in the book. And it is probably best to leave it to forensic professionals who are used to doing testimonies and being medical witnesses, expert witnesses in court, in legal cases. It is what we routinely do. In other words, you speak only about medical matters and do not get involved in the legal or political decision making. In fact, it might help as a neutralizing ground for politics because politics is so much driven by what I often call pre-Socratic methods, driven by power or one's striving for influence, rather than logic or science or facts. Right. And medicine is based purely on those things, and therefore it can help to neutralize some of that partisan struggle.
Now, we've only got about a minute left. You have succeeded in alerting you and your colleagues have succeeded in alerting the public to your concerns. What's next? What's the next step? What is it that you'd like to see happen?
Well, in terms of results, it has been a little disheartening. In fact, as you know, I've been first trying to after the conference, a number of lawmakers have gotten in touch with me, and I was hoping that if the president would not submit to an examination, perhaps Congress would act. It became clear that the Republican Congress was not going to act, even though there was good evidence of their being concerned as well. And that is why I have been speaking out more to the public, hoping that the public will put their support behind the need for an evaluation, right. The need for the president that they have elected to be competent in his position, to be able to carry out the duties that he has been duly elected for. And currently, from all the signs we see, we cannot be sure of that.
I wish we could speak more about this. It's a fascinating topic, but we have run out of time. Dr. Bandy Lee, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. If you think partisan gerrymandering hasn't gotten out of control, consider this from a recent article in the New York Times. The 7th Congressional District in Pennsylvania is nicknamed Goofy Kicking Donald Duck because its highly contorted shape resembles one Disney character planting a foot in the posterior of another. This absurdly shaped district was drawn by Republicans to ensure the election of a Republican congressman named Patrick Meehan. Democrats never stood a chance. Pennsylvania is not alone. Both parties in states across the country have resorted to partisan gerrymandering, carving out legislative districts to favor one party or another. But the Republican Party in recent years has turned gerrymandering into an extreme, gruesomely effective art form. Maps in states controlled by Republican legislatures, which is a majority of states, have placed Democrats at a hopeless disadvantage. Dems might be able to get more votes than Republicans in these states, but the maps are drawn so that the GOP inevitably gets more seats and thus more representation, which turns the whole idea of democracy on its head. But this time, in Pennsylvania, the GOP apparently went too far. The state's highest court has ordered that the goofy Kicking Donald district be thrown out because of its extreme unfairness, and that all of the state's congressional districts be redrawn. This is a welcome win for advocates of fair and truly representative government. A footnote. Congressman Patrick Meehan, the beneficiary of the Goofy District, has announced that he won't be seeking re-election. Meehan, who is married, a member of the House Ethics Committee, and a GOP leader in the fight against sexual harassment, got caught up in a sex scandal of his own. He announced that he would be leaving Congress after it was learned that he had used thousands of taxpayer dollars to settle a complaint that he had made unwanted romantic overtures to a staffer. That's all for now. See you next time.